Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Kiln Rendez-Vous on EigenLayer AVS edition. I'm Edgar, protocol specialist at Kiln, the leading enterprise-grade staking platform, and I'll be your host for today. Today, we're very happy to have Amrit, COO at AltLayer, the company behind the AVS AltLayer. Amrit, hope you're doing well. Could you introduce yourself for us?
Of course. So, thank you very much for inviting me. So my background is, I guess, a typical engineer's background. So I studied mathematics in India, and then I went to Paris. So I went to École Polytechnique. I did my engineering at École Polytechnique for 4 years. And then in my fourth year, I left Paris and I went to Grenoble. This is engineering school called NCMAC there. And it's an engineering school that people go to for your fourth year if you're Polytechnique. So I went there. I studied computer science for the last, I would say, 3 years of my engineering. And then I did a PhD in computer science in Grenoble. And this was the time when blockchain was becoming kind of interesting topic for academic researchers. So people were studying computer science. They were starting to look into blockchain at that time. Before that, it was more like, hey, it's a Bitcoin thing. It's for developers. This maybe interesting thing, but it's not for academic interest. But that was changing in around 2016 or 2015, around the time when Ethereum was being developed, right? And so I was also looking in, or my colleagues were looking in Bitcoin and blockchain in general. And I felt like maybe I should go and do some work in the blockchain space as well because it sounded very exciting. However, when I asked my advisor if I could go and work in a blockchain kind of project, the answer that I got was, you're funded by a certain project, and you have to kind of work in that area. And so I couldn't work in the crypto space at that time. But I was finishing my PhD very soon. So this was around 2016. So I finished my PhD, and then I was looking for a job as a researcher in the blockchain space. And this was the time when ICOs were happening. So this was, I would say, 2016, 2017. And I guess there were two key countries or areas where a lot of these crypto projects were emerging from. Like one was Switzerland. A lot of projects were actually doing fundraise or setting up their foundations in Switzerland. And the other place was Singapore. I felt, maybe I should go back to Asia. So I went to Singapore, and then I joined a local university in Singapore. It was called National University of Singapore. And this was the place where Vitalik used to come, by the way, at that time, quite frequently. He used to do sessions to explain. So he was doing this, I guess, grassroots marketing at that time. So basically onboarding developers into the Ethereum vision and Ethereum ecosystem. I remember there was a guy in our lab called Loy. He was one of the founders of Kyber Network. So this was one of the first or earliest DEXs in the Ethereum space. So I think everyone in the space, in the lab, were working on crypto space, in the blockchain space. And so when I joined in, I wanted to work in blockchain. So I asked my advisor and said, hey, can we work on something in crypto? And he said, unfortunately, there's nothing interesting left to do anymore in the crypto space. Why don't we do machine learning? I was quite disappointed because everyone else in the lab was working on blockchain. I was the only one who was kind of assigned. He was kind of the new guy, and the new guy is supposed to do something new, and that was supposed to be machine learning. Anyway, so I persisted though, and I kind of kept pushing and checking and talking to other colleagues in my lab. And eventually my advisor gave up and said, hey, there's this interesting project called Monero. This was again 2017. And Monero was, I would say probably at that time there were 3 cryptocurrencies which were privacy preserving. One was Dash, Monero, and Zcash, the mainly 3 at the time. And Monero was becoming quite popular, especially for people who were transacting on the dark web. And so my advisor said, why don't you go and look at Monero and see if there's anything interesting to do there? And so me and some of my colleagues in the lab, and we had a French intern, by the way. So he was also from École Polytechnique. So he was doing his, the last year in a foreign country. And so me and him and some of the other colleagues joined hands, and we started working on Monero. And we published a paper on Monero that showed that about 95 to 98% of transactions that happened on Monero were not actually very private. Anyway, so that was my entry into the blockchain space. So I studied Monero white papers first, and then went to go understand how Bitcoin worked. And then, of course, Ethereum. So yeah, that was, I guess, my journey into the crypto space.
Great. So you started with Monero, then Bitcoin. and now you're building AltLayer, which is to simplify a bit something that services rollups. Could you remind the audience what is a rollup?
Yeah, of course. So Rollup is basically an off-chain system that attempts to scale a base layer. So consider, for example, Ethereum, where it has a TPS of maybe 20 maximum TPS per second. And so if you attempt to transact, let's say, more than 20 or even close to that per second, that creates spike in gas fees, and that affects everyone, right? Simply because it's a shared network for everyone. And so again, Ethereum Foundation and the researchers in the core Ethereum team, they're trying to scale Ethereum at the base layer. It's also kind of well understood that as a base layer, it's going to be very hard to scale a blockchain like a layer one. And so the idea is to basically build off-chain systems that would execute transactions on behalf of users. And then Ethereum as a base layer will verify whether this system is operating correctly. And that's exactly what a rollup is. So for example, if you take Arbitrum, Optimism, or ZK Sync, or Polygon CDK, they all operate in a model where you have a server or a set of nodes that they're called sequencers. So you as a user, you will take your transactions and you will send your transaction to the sequencer. Sequencer will execute your transactions. So it will order your transactions, form a block, and then it will execute the block. And that will put all the transactions on Ethereum. And that will say, hey, if you execute all those transactions in this order, you will get this output. So this will be the state of the system. And then anyone can go and verify whether that state is actually valid. And so nowadays you have two main ways in which you can build rollups. One is where you have fraud proof. So basically when the sequencer puts a state on Ethereum and puts the transaction data on Ethereum, anyone in the system can actually check whether this is actually valid. And so if you feel like something has been posted or committed that's wrong, you can go and challenge. So you have to basically say that, hey, I have detected that this transaction has not been processed correctly, and here's the proof. So that's what's called optimistic rollup, where you don't check every single time. You check only when you believe something has gone wrong. So that's optimistic rollup. The second model is what's called ZK rollup, or a validity proof model, where basically for every single transaction that you're putting on chain, you're also creating a proof that says, hey, this transaction was indeed processed correctly, and here's the proof. And that proof gets verified by Ethereum network. So at a high level, rollups are basically an off-chain system that execute transactions on behalf of users, and Ethereum basically verifies that that off-chain system is behaving and operating correctly.
Okay, super clear. So in this context, could you explain a bit what is AltLayer and what AltLayer is trying to achieve using EigenLayer?
Of course. So the thing about rollups is that when you build a rollup attached to a base chain like Ethereum, you are actually moving execution out of Ethereum, right? So you're saying, hey, all executions that used to happen on Ethereum will not happen on Ethereum directly, it will happen on the rollup. Now, when you move execution out of Ethereum, you can do interesting things because you're no longer limited by Ethereum's, let's say, smart contract, let's say the runtime environment that Ethereum offers. For example, let's say, if you want to have a new opcode, for example, or if you need to customize your runtime in some way, you could do that through rollups. So for example, people today, they're building Move VM, people Move-based rollups, people are building Solana VM-based rollups. You can imagine all sorts of new things that you can build and innovate on the rollup side that doesn't need to happen, that cannot happen on Ethereum. So what that has done is people have started to build application-specific rollups. So imagine you're building a fully on-chain game, and your game contract is so huge that you simply cannot deploy that on Ethereum because Ethereum has certain constraints on how large your contract can be. And so what you could do is you could say, hey, I'm going to build a rollup, and I'll put my contract on this rollup, and I can customize my rollup in a way that allows me to deploy a larger contract. And so this is one example of how rollups can allow you to not just scale Ethereum, but also customize Ethereum in some ways. So you're not directly customizing Ethereum, but you're customizing your own environment in which you can run your contracts. And so basically that has led to this birth of a lot of application-specific rollups. And this was the idea that we started back in 2021, where we felt like, hey, app chains like Cosmos are great, but it's quite painful to go and bootstrap an app chain like Cosmos because you have to go and find hundreds of validators, you have to incentivize them. And if your token does not do well, the validators have no incentive to continue and operate the network. Or if your network doesn't do enough transactions, you're basically paying a lot of money for free to these validators, which are actually not really doing much because the transactions are not there. And so a good model would be something like app rollups, because all you need is one sequencer and that can still process transactions, because in the end, Ethereum is the one that secures your rollups. You don't need hundreds of validators, right? So your cost to bootstrap a network becomes much cheaper. And so AltLayer had this vision of app-specific chains will become big. And I think we are seeing that today. And one, because all these prominent rollups like Optimism, Arbitrum, zk-Sync, Polygon, they're all building their own stacks now. So now you have OP stack, you have Arbitrum Orbit, you have zk stack, you have Polygon CDK. And what they basically try to do is they are saying, hey, now that we have Optimism, let's say Arbitrum and zk-Sync, you can actually build an app-specific instance of these chains, for your specific application. So you can take OP stack and say build your own chain or build your own rollup on which you can go and run your application. So in the first stage, AltLayer does one thing. It makes it easier for people to deploy these app-specific rollups. So we offer this Raas service, Rollup as a service. And the goal is, if let's say you are a game builder and you do not understand how sequences work, you don't want to understand how data availability works, we can come to us and we will run and manage a rollup for you. So that's first part. The second part is, many of these rollups, the way they exist today, they're not very decentralized. So for example, if you look at Optimism or Arbitrum or even CDK, all of them operate with a single sequencer. Even though having a single sequencer is not a huge security risk, but there are liveness issues with the sequencers. For example, if the sequencer goes down, it's quite painful to go and get your transaction processed. I mean, there are caveats around, yes, you can still go and deposit, send your transaction to the L1. But in case of Arbitrum, for example, there's a 24-hour delay, and it complicates a bit of user's life. And so it's good to have decentralized sequencing inbuilt with the rollup. And so what we're doing right now with EigenLayer is that we have proposed this idea of what we call restaked rollups. So essentially, we take OP stack, Arbitrum Orbit, or any of the rollup stacks that are out there, and we combine that with EigenLayer's restaking mechanism to build, for example, decentralized sequencing. So the simple way to understand this would be, if you are building an OP stack rollup and you say, hey, I want to have 5 sequences instead of just having one, and you would say, if you want to become one of my sequencers, you have to bring a certain amount of economic collateral. So you would say, if you bring $10 million worth of economic collateral, then you're allowed to become one of my sequencers. And then enough people deposit these collateral, they would eventually become your sequencers, they would operate your rollup. So basically, this whole thing runs as an AVS, which is the short for actively validated system. And so service, where basically you would say, hey, my sequencer network is an AVS. And if you want to become an operator for that AVS, you have to bring an asset to secure this AVS. And this could come from STETH or any of the assets that EigenLayer supports. And as long as you stake that through EigenLayer or restake that through EigenLayer, you can become and secure the system. And so that's how basically AltLayer operates. Absolutely. We offer restaking rollups, and that comes with EigenLayer's restaking mechanism with rollups.
Okay, fantastic. And so if I had to sum up, there is one side which is the restaked rollups, so everything that you're doing there, and one other side that's the Raas platform, the rollup as a service. And my question is, are they both leveraging EigenLayer?
So it's kind of like Raas today is centralized. So when you go and talk to Raas service, Raas vendor will go and run your sequencer for you, right? And the AVS component, the restaked rollup component, is more of a decentralized version of Raas. So imagine saying, hey, I don't want to have a Raas vendor and I want to get my committee involved. So, okay, the problem with Raas is, one, if you're talking to a Raas, if you're using a Raas service, one, you're centralized, number one. Number two is the Raas vendor has no incentive to let you go. So, for example, if, let's say, you're using a Raas service and you want to, at some point in the future, want to bring the entire service in-house, you can't do that because there's no incentive for Raas vendor to let it go because they will basically lose the business, right? And so it's not in their best interest to actually allow people to basically move away from Raas. But as a builder, you actually want that because What might happen is if you stay with a RAS vendor, you may have signed a contract with them, and the contract says, hey, you have to use our services for maybe 1 year. And then at the end of 1 year, if you go and reach out to them and say, hey guys, we want to renew the contract, they would say, hey, yeah, now you have to pay double the fee that you're paying previously. So there's a platform risk of using a RAS service. Even though in principle, you can go and move from one RAS vendor to another one, actually it's not so straightforward, right? And RAS vendors do not make it easy for you to go. And so it's good. It would be good to have some sort of a decentralized service that allows you to either bring everything in-house or make it more decentralized where you can go and get your community involved. So imagine today you're using a RAS service with a single node or single vendor compared to, let's say, you have, let's say, a 5-node or 6-node or 10-node system where you're asking, let's say, one of the validators in the Ethereum ecosystem to come and operate your rollup. Imagine Figment and some of the big guys in the market who could come and operate your rollup. So you get a lot of ecosystem, benefit and marketing benefits of engaging your broader community. So I would say AVS is more of a decentralized version of a RAS system.
All right. Okay. And so I think you're describing many things. Are you describing one big AVS or are you describing multiple different AVS? And my other question is, does that mean that operators and restakers will have the choice which set of AVSs within the ones you mentioned to support?
Yeah, so basically in the Restaked framework, we offer 3 kinds of AVSs. So basically there are 3 main products. One is what we call Squad, which is basically decentralized sequencing. So you would say, hey, I want to have 5 sequences, and this squad will basically act as an AVS for decentralized sequencing. So that's number 1. Number 2 is what we call Vital, which is an AVS for verification. And the reason you want verification is because if you look at Arbitrum today, you have these nodes that check whether the sequences are behaving correctly, and if not, they would do fraud proofs, right? They would challenge. It'd be good to bake that system directly into application-specific rules. The idea is once you start a rollup, you will have these nodes that will verify the system for you and will check, if everything is operating correctly. And the third one is what we call MAC, which is an AVS for faster finality. So it's kind of like when you send your transaction to sequencer today, they give you this kind of pinky promising, hey, I have seen your transaction. At some point in the future, I will put those transactions on Ethereum. But that guarantee is very weak. And so the idea is, can you bring economic guarantees behind it to offer finality? So this is what MAC does. So at a high level, there are 3 different AVSs, one called Squad, Vital, and MAC. Now, the thing is, each one of them can be dedicated to each specific rollup. So you could have, let's say, a gaming chain. A gaming rollup will have its own Squad, MAC, and Vital. Then let's say DeFi project will have its own Squad, MAC, and Vital, and so on. So in principle, there will be many of these AVSs per rollup, basically. And then operators will pick and decide which AVS to support. So for example, there could be a rollup that's really big. So imagine tomorrow Uniswap does a rollup, let's say, for example. Everyone in the space would like to serve that rollup, right? And so it will also depend on which operators decide to serve which rollup, because maybe it may depend on the risk, it may depend on the reward, it may also depend on the publicity and how big that project is or how big that rollup is.
Okay. And is it also possible for rollups to only pick specific pieces of these 3 verticals? And where do you think, where is the focus of AltLayer? What do you think is the most valuable thing that AltLayer brings for the rollup ecosystem out of those 3?
So yeah, the answer to your first question was yes. They are all built as a modular component, and so you can pick and choose which one you want. So a rollup would come and say, hey, I only want decentralized sequencing because that's what's most important to them. So they don't have to use Vital and MAC if they don't want. That's the first component. And sorry, I forgot the second question. What was the second question? Sorry.
The second question was actually which one of those 3 do you think brings the most value to the rollup ecosystem?
I think they're all equally valuable depending on who you talk to. So for example, if you're, let's say, building a DeFi project, you want to make sure that so a DeFi project may have a large TVL. So imagine building a perps or something of that kind, which brings a lot of TVL in your rollup. And you want to make sure that that TVL is secured, right? And so if you have a sequencer, you want to make sure that the sequencer, if it posts transaction data on Ethereum or somewhere, those state are actually verified properly. That may not be so interesting for someone like, let's say, gaming company, right? Gaming company may not have a huge TVL, so they don't care that much about security. What they do care about is latency. So they want to make sure that when I send up a transaction to this rollup, my transaction gets finality quite quickly, right? And so a faster finality would be ideal. Because if you go and use Ethereum as your finality layer, it will take you something between 12 to 15 minutes to actually get your transaction finalized. And you cannot wait for that. And so I think it depends on which sector you're targeting. I would say, gaming companies would be more inclined towards faster finality, or DeFi projects would be more inclined towards something that gives them more security for the assets that are held there.
Okay, fantastic. And that's actually a good point, because my next question is around what are the rollups that you're currently working with / talking to, and how do your AVS usually compare with, for example, the competition? Like, for example, for decentralized sequencing, there is Espresso, and there might be other AVSs or totally different chains that might compete with you on those verticals.
Yeah, so let me ask the second question first, because it's more pertinent, and then I'll come back to the examples of which clients and who we are working with. So in terms of so decentralized sequencing comes in many shapes and forms. And as you said, one form is like what Espresso offers or Astri offers, which is called shared sequencing. And the model in which Espresso works is, you as a user, you will take your transactions and you will send that to Espresso, and Espresso network will then order your transactions. And once they have ordered the transaction, they will send it back to you and say, hey, we have run a consensus protocol on those transactions, and here's an order that we propose. And then the rollup node will go and process transactions. So for example, let's say in a Raas context, Raas provider will take the transactions from the RPC, it will send those transactions to the Espresso network, Espresso network will return that back, and the Raas provider will then execute those transactions. Okay. Now, there are several things several differences between a decentralized sequencing in which AVS operates, like Squad, and the way Espresso operates. One difference is that when you're a rollup and when you want to use Espresso, you do not control who becomes your sequencer, right? Espresso, the whole network is basically your sequencer in some way, right? And so, if, for example, if you wanted, let's say you're a gaming company, and if you wanted, Ubisoft or Bandai or some of your partners to become your sequencer, you cannot do that, because Espresso has its own way of onboarding validators and sequencers for your rollup, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is, you do not get to decide the sequencing policy that will be applied on your rollup. So, for example, Espresso validators may have this policy of, hey, let's go and maximize MEV for ourselves. So let's go and do sandwich attacks, let's go and do all sorts of things that we could imagine, and let's extract as much value as we can from end-user transactions. Maybe this is the policy that you may not like as a rollup builder. Or you could say, look, my users are of utmost importance to us, and we would not like any sandwich attacks happening on our users. And so you cannot control the sequencing policy in your case, right? Because you are basically using Espresso as a shared network. So Espresso will have a common policy for all the rollups that are attached to them. While when you're using decentralized sequencing in the AVS model, you control the sequencer. So you say, hey, this is my friend, this is my ecosystem partner, this is my custodian, or this is my gaming partner. I want these 5 people to become my sequencer. And if you don't like them, you can kick them out. So maybe through a governance mechanism, maybe through some mechanism, you could say, hey, every year I'm going to select 5 people, and if I don't like them, I'm going to kick them out maybe after a year through governance mechanism. So you literally control who becomes your AVS operator in the end. You also control the sequencing policy that you want to impose. So you could say, hey, if you want to become my AVS, my operator in my AVS, you have to abide by this policy, which is, let's say, minimize MEV, not maximize MEV. And if any operator is detected that they're actually sandwiching or front-running users, then they will be kicked out. And these, you don't have that flexibility if you use something like Espresso. So I would say that's the kind of main benefit or difference between what we are doing versus what Espresso does. There's another, I guess, similarity with another kind of project AVS, which is called the witness chain, where basically what they do is they operate these, what they call watchtower networks. So basically it's a network of nodes that observes rollups and checks whether anything is detected as malicious. And what they do is they will raise an alarm. They will say, hey, your sequencer is not behaving correctly. Here's something that we noticed. But watchtower network generally does not go and does challenge. Right? It doesn't do anything beyond that. It only raises alerts. It doesn't do beyond that. And what we do with Vital is you actually can go and do a challenge. And you could say, hey, I have seen this, but I can also, here's the proof that I've seen this, and here's the proof that you cannot contest. Right? So it goes a little bit step further than just watching the network and actually doing and taking actions on top of that. And also our AVS Vital can also apply to ZK rollups as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be optimistic. So I would say these are the main differences with something like Espresso as a decentralized sequencing and something like Watchtower Network that also does a witness chain that offers this Watchtower service. Now coming back to the second question, the first question, I suppose, which was, which are the partners that we're working with? Overall, we have spoken to almost 200 clients so far. Many of them are already signed up with our Raas service. So at the moment, our AVS is still being built. It's not fully ready yet. So most of the clients that we have, they are currently using our Raas services. And the idea is to basically transition them to our AVS format once that's ready. We have gaming companies like, there's a gaming company in France, by the way, called Cometh. They build, they have their own Orbit chain called Cosmic. And this is a chain that will have its own game built on that. We have, I think, about 10 other gaming companies working, in Asia and beyond. There's another called, I think it's a Belgian one called Punishing Monsters. So we have seen quite a bit of demand across gaming. I would say about 90% of our clients still come from gaming sector, simply because game is one area where people have felt that if you want to offer good gaming experience to end users, you have to build your own rollup. And so that's kind of reason why we have seen quite a bit of demand from gaming companies. We're also seeing a lot of DeFi nowadays, especially on the derivative side of things, so people building options, perps, and so on. We also work very closely with a gaming company called Double Jump Tokyo in Japan. So they have some of the best, I guess, IPs, Web2 style IPs, developed by Bandai and some of the best, Web2 gaming companies. And the idea for them is to basically take some of those gaming IPs and convert them into Web 2.5 or Web 3 games.
Sorry, we're losing you.
Oh, sorry, can you hear me now?
Sorry, Amrit, we lost you. We lost you for a couple of seconds. Could you just rewind a little bit, please?
Yeah. So basically, we are also working with a gaming company called Double Jump Tokyo. They're based out of Japan, and they have some biggest IPs from Bandai and Ubisoft and the others. And the idea for them is to take those IPs and convert that into a Web 2.5 Web 3 games. So you are one of the exclusive partners to offer those games to be on the rollup. So yeah, I would say 90% of our companies, of our clients, are still using Raas, but we plan to convert them to rollups, and they're mostly gaming companies, and some of them are actually now building DeFi products as well.
Fantastic. So my follow-up question, Amrit, is so you have a very big ecosystem of rollups. When do you think that AltLayer will be ready to launch its AVSs on EigenLayer to support these rollups?
Yeah, so we're planning to actually follow EigenLayer itself. So EigenLayer, we're waiting for EigenLayer's mainnet to go live because I think it'd be risky to go mainnet on our side before EigenLayer goes mainnet. Even though in principle you could do that, but I don't think it's a good idea to do that. And so we basically will be following EigenLayer. So I believe it will be sometime in Q2. Again, as I said, it depends on EigenLayer, but we're targeting Q2 internally to be prepared. When the EigenLayer goes mainnet, we will go mainnet right after that.
Okay, so you'll be launching in conjunction with EigenDA?
Yeah, so EigenDA and generally speaking, all the EigenLayer, let's say contracts going mainnet ready, right? I mean, even though the contracts are live, we still kind of need the blessings and stamp from EigenLayer team say, okay, these contracts are ready to be used in production. And EigenDA, I think probably will go alongside Eigen AVS contracts, I suppose.
we're definitely excited for all of these AVSs coming to market. My next set of questions would be around revenue. So we're trying to represent the Restakers and all of the AVSs that you have mentioned, all of the services that you're going to be providing with Rollup. How can a Restaker think of the potential, the revenue potential for all of this? And EigenLayer is going to attract a lot of staked economic security. So it's always very challenging for us to understand if all of the revenue that the AVSs would be generating will be able to provide meaningful added rewards for Restakers.
Of course. So I think that there are many ways or many forms in which the revenue or the incentives will come. So one is, let's say you have a rollup that actually generates a lot of revenue itself. So for example, today, if you look at Arbitrum generates a lot of revenue from sequencing fee, right? So imagine similar rollup that comes out and it generates revenue from sequencing fee. And the basic idea is, user puts, let's say the gas fee is $1. So $1 is what the sequencer has to pay to Ethereum to secure that transaction, basically, right? And so sequencer will basically charge something on top of that, and that basically will go back as sequencing revenue, right? So the first thing would be sequencing revenue that will be shared with the Restakers, right? So because if you become an AVS for, let's say, decentralized sequencing, you would have access to the sequencing revenue. So that's the first thing. The second thing would be, we also have our own token. So that will also be used to incentivize people to come and serve these AVSs. So that's number two. The third one would be the token that the rollup may have, right? So let's say I'm building a gaming rollup and I'm asking a certain operator to come and serve as a sequencer for my rollup, then I would have to provide some incentive for them, right? And so there will be some incentive that comes from the dApp token itself. And then potentially, if EigenLayer team is generous, there could be potentially some incentive from EigenLayer team itself, right? So I would say there could be the 3 or 4 different layers of incentives that I think, it could vary depending on which rollup you're talking about. So there could be a big rollup, they may have huge sequencing revenue. There could be other rollup, they may not have that huge sequencing revenue, so they may have to compensate a little bit more with the token side. The one that generates a lot of revenue, they may not have to do, compensate with the token side. So I think there'll be different ways in which some of these rollups will incentivize. But of course, there's one component that will come from our side as well, which is our token to incentivize some of the people who are building, and supporting AVSs that are secured by AltLayer.
That's a great segue to my next question. And I don't know if you have already thought of all of the tokenomics around the AltLayer token, but one thing that's very interesting is how do you think of revenue in AltLayer token for Restakers? How do you allocate like the AltLayer revenue that you'll be providing operators depending on the different types of jobs that they may be doing in the AltLayer ecosystem of AVSs?
Yeah, so it will again depend on, so normally, so imagine if you're building a rollup and let's say you don't have a token, right? And then in that case, alt becomes alongside, let's say, an LST or staked asset. It becomes kind of the dual token model where you will have alt and you have any of the LSTs that are securing or that are being restaked, right? In that model, we'll enforce a certain percentage that has to come from alt token, a percentage that comes from, let's say, the restaked assets, right? So for example, it could be 50-50. We haven't fully decided on how that would look like, but there'll be a percentage. So you will be forced to bring at least a certain amount of tokens that will have to come from all tokens. And then again, the revenue will basically, or the rewards will basically get divided accordingly. It's kind of like the quorum model that EigenLayer has, where you have basically 2 pools, and then the incentive will go according to that pool, right? In a model where the dApp already has a token, in that model we potentially may have a 3-token model where you could have the dApp token, the alt token, and the restaked assets. And again, the incentive would be divided accordingly, depending on which part we want to incentivize. So of course, there will be incentive for people who stake all tokens. But again, I think we still have to see and go by the year a little bit and see how those numbers will actually look like. We haven't finalized concrete numbers yet because there are certain moving parts around, whether dApp has a token or not has a token and so on and so forth. But yeah, alt will be used as one of the key token that has to be staked alongside any staked assets.
Okay. So just to summarize, the Restakers expected revenue will come from the AltLayer token, potentially ETH as well, and potentially even the Rollup token that they'll be securing.
Correct. So sequencing revenue, so whatever money that sequencer makes, I think they can share a portion of that. All tokenized rewards, and then the dApp token, if the dApp has a token. Because if a dApp is, because in the end, AVS is not serving AltLayer, AVS is serving a certain rollup. And so rollup has to provide certain incentive for the AVS operators to actually go and serve that AVS. So there has to be an incentive that has to come from the underlying dApp.
And what happens, for example, if a rollup is not profitable enough for the AltLayer operators to run? Is there like a committee to decide on which rollup will have to leave the AltLayer set? How does it work?
Yeah, so this is something, again, we have to see how this will work, especially in the LRT model, right, where LRTs have to somehow decide which AVSs to support and which AVSs they will redirect the restaked assets to. And so I feel like at some point when if the incentives for an operator is not large enough, then I think the LRTs will have to kind of rethink and say, look, the guys, it's this AVS is not interesting enough for us, and so we have to vote them out in some way. So I think it will all boil down to incentives and how the incentives plays out eventually, and then how the LRTs behave, how the LRTs decide on which AVS to support and things like that. I think it's a little bit of open in the air. Even when I talk to some of the LRT providers, they're still kind of discussing how to assess the risk and reward kind of scenario for all these AVs so that they need to select. So I don't have a firm answer to it. I guess in some ways there will be some sort of governance mechanism where the operators will say, look, this AVS is not interesting enough for me. But it doesn't apply to rollup as well. So imagine, like, AltLayer's rollups are one kind of rollup, right? You could have other rollups as well, right? Other kinds of AVS as well. So for example, you could imagine an AVS for liquidity layer. So people building a liquidity layer as an AVS, people building Chainlink as an AVS. And again, the LRT providers have to somehow decide which AVSs are really, really valuable for them in terms of incentives and reward. And then at some point through governance, they will have to say, okay, this AVS, we should stop supporting because either it's too risky for us, maybe. It's not just about reward, it's also about risk as well, right? Because it could be too risky for us. It could be the case where this AVS has a very long unbonding period. So imagine, I don't know, I have an AVS, and that AVS is super, it gives you a huge incentive, but it locks your assets for maybe, 3 months or 4 months, kind of like the voted escrow model that, we have popular in the DeFi space, right? So if they lock you for 3 years, you will have a huge incentive, but is it worth it? I don't know. I think the LRT providers will have to kind of assess, or operators have to assess which ones really make sense for them. And if at any point of time they feel like it's not worthy enough, I think they would stop supporting them. In the same way that happens in the POS chains today, right? If let's say if you're supporting as a validator a certain POS chain, if at some point, let's say the token drops or incentives are not strong enough, you stop supporting it, right? You kind of pull out. And so it's kind of, I guess it will be similar social style model as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess we can close. We can finish by talking a bit about the Rollup as a service platform that AltLayer offers. We've seen recently Dimension, the Cosmos chain launch just yesterday actually, which is also I would say something similar than AltLayer. It enables users to launch their own rollups. So how do you see AltLayer's solution compared to others? We can use Dimension. Maybe Dimension is very typical, but we can also use Caldera and Conduit as an example.
Yeah, I think Caldera and Conduit are probably a better example for Raas. I mean, Dimension is slightly more than that, I would say. They also have a settlement layer, and I think the focus is not necessarily pure Raas, but a little bit more than that. I think a good example for Raas would be something like Caldera and Conduit. And so, if you compare any Raas service, they are more or less the same. I would say there's no fundamental difference between Caldera's Raas service or AltLayer's Raas service or Conduit's Raas service. They're more or less the same. All they're basically doing is they're taking a certain SDK and saying, hey, we are taking, let's say, Rollup SDK like, OP Stack, and we would run and manage the sequencer and the rest of the service for you. Right. My belief is that it is something that we internally strongly believe that RAS in the long term does not have a long-term moat. The reason why I see is that it's in essence what you're doing is you're taking a certain SDK and you're wrapping it around an AWS or doing your DevOps bit and hosting that. And that doesn't build any network effect. That doesn't build anything. And so in the long term, we believe that RAS have to become decentralized. It cannot just be where you have a vendor and you ask your vendor to run the system for you and they will run it. It does maybe initially when you are talked to, and by the way, this is why we started with the Restaked rollup idea, because when we talk to all these clients that come to us for RAS services, they say, hey, it's good that you serve us this rollup as service, but what if in the future we wanted to bring this whole service in-house? What if we wanted to run this sequencer ourselves at some point? And so that was the first question. The second question was that, hey, what if we wanted to decentralize the system? What if we wanted to move away from your service and move to Caldera, for example? Right? How do you do that? And so I think the main problem was that RAS in general is a very closed system, right? And it doesn't work very well with the blockchain ethos of openness and decentralization. And so the Restaked idea actually allows RAS vendors to actually compete in open market. So for example, let's say if you say, hey, I want to have 5 sequences, one of the sequencer could be run by Caldera, the other one could be run by Conduit, third could be by AltLayer, fourth could be by Dimension, for example. So it makes the system much more open, where you're not locked by legal contracts that you have signed with Caldera or Conduit or AltLayer. You're much more driven by the market dynamics. If let's say committee says, hey, all these RAS services that are serving my sequencers should bring a certain amount of collateral, they have to bring that collateral as well. So I think there's a lot of skin in the system game as well, and I think it becomes much more decentralized and open. So I would say RAS services in the end will become more decentralized and will resemble a lot like decentralized sequencing.
Perfect. Yeah, and talking a bit about that long-term future for RAS and maybe for Rollups in general, how do you see the longer roadmap of Ethereum regarding Rollups?
I mean, Ethereum has already committed to this, rollup-centric roadmap, and we have seen that, over the last 2-3 years with, Starknet, Arbitrum, Optimism, zk-SYNC, and a bunch of others. I think what we didn't realize back in the day, like 2 years ago, that we will have so many rollup instantiations, right? We will have so many SDKs that will allow people to deploy rollups. And literally in the last, I would say, 7 or 10 days, we have on board at least 15 clients who want to use apps, like app-specific rollups. That shows the promise of how people want to have, their own instances. Maybe not everyone will survive. Maybe in the next 2-3 years, many of these rollups will realize that, okay, it's not probably the best model for them. But I think it's pretty clear to me, and I think it's pretty clear to the space, that if you go and want to have a consumer-facing application, like let's say imagine Farcaster, right, which is quite hyped in the last few days with the launch of Frames. If Farcaster really becomes big to a point where it handles even 1/10 of Twitter's, user volume, it has to go on this own chain. There's no way, a general purpose chain like Base can handle all of that, right? They have to go on an app-specific chain. And they may want to customize their chain for different needs, right? And so, sadly, we haven't seen a huge consumer-facing application quite yet in the crypto space. We have seen Uniswaps, we have seen Aave and Compound and OpenSea and whatnot, but still has not touched an average user on the street, right? If you go and pick a random person on the street, they probably would not know what a Uniswap is. And I think if we're just waiting for the time when you will have a consumer-facing application, and if you have a consumer-facing blockchain application, it simply cannot run on a general purpose chain. You have to have an app-specific instance to capture value, to offer better experience to users. And the first thing is, if you look at Ethereum or in any general purpose chain today, right? When you send a transaction to Ethereum today, you're paying a fee to the applications. For example, if you're trading on Uniswap, you're paying a fee to Uniswap, but you're also paying a fee to Ethereum validators, right? And if you think about it, right, that's very counterintuitive. If you look at the Web 2 world, when you tweet on Twitter, you don't pay Twitter and your internet service provider every single time you make a tweet. You don't do that. And so this model that you have to pay fees at 2 different levels every single time you send a transaction, I think it's a bit of It's a very poor user experience. And you can change many of that if you build your own app-specific rollup, right? Because you can customize in many different ways, right? I do believe that, to offer people better user experience, to be able to customize the experience, you will need an app-specific rollup. So I think eventually you will see a lot of the bigger apps will definitely go and have their own shape, for sure.
That makes a lot of sense, and this is also like a vision that we're sharing internally at Kiln. A lot of our team members are very excited about the future for Rollups, and something that we take very, very seriously. I guess one thing to finish up is, what do you have any recommendations for future Restakers that are listening to this podcast? Anything to look at in the context of AltLayer? Anything to search in general to better understand what's at stake with EigenLayer as a whole?
Yeah, so look, I mean, for those, there are two kinds of people. One who are still holding ETH in their ledger wallet and whatnot, get involved. I think EigenLayer and the broader restaking ecosystem is growing by the day. I think the next 6-8 months is going to be huge. The EigenLayer is going to grow tremendously in the next 6-8 months. Many of the AVSs are going to go live. Many of the LRTs are live, but they're not serving any of the AVS quite yet. But I think that will change, quite quickly in the next 6-8 months. So if you're holding, get involved. Of course, do understand the risk, but do get involved within the ecosystem. And those who are already involved, do understand different AVSs that are operating in the market. Again, AltLayer is one of the AVSs, and we would love to have your assets used to secure our AVSs. But also look beyond. I think there are many interesting things being built in the AVS space, and I think you also, as a restaker, you also have a responsibility to basically convince the operators to pick a certain AVS of your choice. Because what you don't want is, hey, I'm staking with, let's say, one of the LRT providers, and the LRT provider, on its own decides a certain AVS, based on their risk or reward, policy, which you may not like. So also get involved in some of those conversations where you can say, hey, I have my assets staked with a certain provider, but I want to also make sure that the AVS that I like and love gets involved or gets supported through my assets. So learn a lot about AVS and use that knowledge to pass it down to the LRT provider or any of the operators that you're using, and convince them to go and support your favorite AVS that you're excited about.
Amazing. And Kiln is definitely like aware of its responsibility in better understanding AVSs and being able to also help restakers make an educated choice. Amrit, thank you so much for participating in our podcast. I would love to have you on for maybe like another session when the AVS launch is imminent, and maybe you have more details on tokenomics and so on. Last question for you, maybe, is will you be at ETH Denver?
Unfortunately, no, I won't be at ETH Denver, but my colleague Yao-Chi, he will be there. I think he's speaking at quite a few events. So if you're going there, I'm sure you will meet him at one of the EigenLayer events or one of the events for the AVS operators on AVSs in general.
Perfect. We'll be sure to talk to the AltLayer team. Now is your time. If you want to share some of your socials, you can. If you want to share a Twitter or something about AltLayer, feel free.
Yeah, of course. Look, the best place, of course, in the crypto space is Twitter. So if you're not following us, go and follow our Twitter account. It's alt_layer. And this is where we update on our progress. And so once some of the AVSs are live and ready, you would be able to learn more about them. And also, we also post about different rollups that we support. So eventually, many of these rollups will go to the AVS route. So the sooner you learn about these rollups, the better you can make a choice on which rollups to and which AVS to actually support eventually. So follow our Twitter account. That's the best place to learn more about AltLayer. And again, website and docs if you want to dig deeper into how these different AVSs that we're building will operate, once it's fully ready. And again, thank you very much for inviting me. And for those who are listening.
It was our pleasure. Thank you so much again, Amrit, and to the audience. We will see you soon in the next episode of our podcast series. Stay tuned. Have a nice one.